In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my all-knowing Sage build. This is a build that focuses on using the right spell for every situation that you're in, finding the enemy or boss weakness, and utilizing the right spell in order to capitalize on that, trivializing a lot of fights in this game. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this video, and we'll start by talking about the staff that I'm using for this build, which is the Staff of the Great Beyond. This is a new one that was added with the DLC. And what's really unique about this staff is that it can cast both sorceries and incantations, so you don't have to swap back and forth between your Sacred Seal and your staff when you're doing a Sage build. And if you didn't know, Sage build is typically any build that uses both Intelligence and Faith. I have several other Sage builds on the channel if you've been following it at all, but this one focuses on mixing up your spells for the right situation. So we're using the Staff of the Great Beyond, and we're going to increase our Intelligence and Faith in order to capitalize on the scaling of this staff. It doesn't have the greatest sorcery scaling compared to other staffs in the game, but it's not terrible. You're sacrificing damage with this weapon in order to have the flexibility of not needing a Sacred Seal and being able to just cast any spell you want as you cycle through, which is really nice, particularly if you're in boss fights or you're out on the landscape and you're in pressured situations. You don't have to constantly swap out your gear. However, we do have pretty decent sorcery scaling at 50 int and 50 faith, which is where I'm at right now. We're getting 315 sorcery scaling, which is not terrible. It's not amazing. You get about 373 sorcery scaling with the Carrion Regal Scepter at 80 intelligence, and you get, I think, 353 incantation scaling with the Erdtree Seal at 80 faith. So you're a little bit behind those, but you don't have to swap, which is just one of the nice benefits of this weapon. And as you can probably see from the footage already, our damage is already really high, so we're not having trouble killing bosses at all. However, because we have points in Intelligence and Faith, which you wouldn't have if you went Carrion Regal Scepter or you went Erdtree Seal, you're able to use basically any spell that you want. You can't use all spells in the game because you don't have high enough stats yet, but eventually you will be able to. Whereas if you're playing a sorcery build, you're only going to be able to use sorceries, really. If you're playing an incantation build, you're only going to be able to use incantations. But what this allows us to do is, again, cast the right spell for the right situation against, a boss. We know what the weaknesses are. They're located on the wiki. So picking out the best spells based on your knowledge of the spells to attack those bosses and their weaknesses is what this build is all about. And that's why I called it the all-knowing Sage build, because if you know what the weaknesses of these enemies and bosses are, and you know what spells to use, you can absolutely devastate them and kill bosses in under a minute in most cases. And this is obviously a more advanced build, one for people that know the weaknesses of bosses, one that for people that are familiar with the spells. And obviously, if you aren't familiar with these things, I will try and make you more familiar with them in this video. So at 80 Intelligence and 80 Faith, the sorcery scaling of this weapon is 352. So you're not getting a lot of increase between 50-50 and 80-80. You're getting about, 37 points of sorcery scaling for a 60 stat point investment. That's not great in my opinion. So at this point, we haven't taken these stats higher, even though we eventually will in probably New Game Plus. We focused on other things like Mind in order to be able to cast tons of spells without having to use Flasks, particularly in boss fights, that just make it easier to play this build. And naturally, paired with this staff, we're using the Sword of Night and Flame here. This is a weapon that scales very well with Intelligence and Faith, has a little bit of strength and dexterity scaling as well. We just have the minimum requirements on those in order to use the weapon. And what's really great about increasing both Intelligence and Faith is that you can use either weapon skill of this weapon very, very effectively. You can use the magic version effectively, and you can use the fire version very effectively in certain boss fights. And unlike some mage builds where maybe their melee weapon is simply there as a backup, you will notice when you're watching some of this footage that I'm using this weapon in boss fights and fighting enemies on the landscape. It's very, very effective as well, because we know the weaknesses and we're using the fire or magic depending on what those are. So for armor for this build, you can really use any armor that you want. I'm using 3 pieces of the all-knowing set, and then I'm using the Great Helm for the kind of look that I have. The main thing that I was going for is 51 poise. What armor you wear is not super important. You might mix and match this up depending on what incantations or spells you're casting. Some of those benefit, certain stats or certain sorcery or incantation types. So you could change this around if you want. I haven't done that in this build. I think you can see that the damage is high enough that you don't need to. So really, you can use whatever you want here. The main thing is you just want to make sure that you have enough poise, that you're not staggered out of the interruption of casts a lot of the time. So for talismans for this build, it's quite flexible, and you might need several for this build to take full advantage of it. And one of the talismans that I constantly use with this build is Godfrey Icon. I tend to focus on spells that can be charged for maximum damage, and there are plenty of spells across all different damage types that can be charged. So try and focus on finding spells, whether they're magic damage, fire damage, holy damage, etc., that can be charged to take advantage of that and keep that one slotted when possible. And depending on whether you're casting sorceries or you're casting incantations in a particular boss fight or stretch of the game, you're going to switch back and forth between the Graven Mask Talisman for sorceries and Flock's Canvas Talisman for incantations. So, like if you're going into a boss fight and you're throwing fire incantations, you're going to slot Flock's Canvas into Talisman. And then if you're going into like a boss fight but you're flinging, magic spells that are sorceries, you're going to use the Graven Mask Talisman, and you can just swap these out and these two will be interchangeable. Additionally, one slot is going to be occupied by Scorpion Charms, depending on what damage type you're dealing. Magic, fire, sacred, or lightning. Whichever element damage type you're dealing, that's the Scorpion Charm that you're going to be slotting at that time. And then for your last slot, it can vary depending on what you're doing. I find Blessed Blue Dew Talisman is great when you're exploring dungeons or on the landscape to replenish FP. It's not so good in boss fights simply because it doesn't replenish it fast enough for them. You could use Crusade Insignia for more damage on kills. You could use Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for extra stamina. This is particularly good in boss fights because we don't have a ton of endurance. This allows us to dodge and still fling spells very easily and attack. Or you might want something like the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for more protection because we are using a Scorpion Charm which will reduce our physical protection. And you can even use Ritual Sword Talisman if you're confident enough you won't get hit. I tend to be very, very aggressive in boss fights and I do trade damage sometimes, so I don't use it. But if you're very confident or you're using it out on the landscape where you're not getting hit much, that's when you could also use to boost your spell damage. And special mention to Old Lord's Talisman too, because this can extend your Golden Vow buff. It can extend like Blessing's Boon on yourself. It can extend Flame Grant Me Strength on yourself, depending if you're using that or not, depending on what damage type you're using. That can be coming in handy too, particularly when you're either doing physical damage or you're doing fire damage. So let's talk about spells for this build and the different elements. I'm not going to go through every single spell, but I will go through some of the ones you see in this video, ones that I like. So first of all, talking about holy damage, I really like the new spell Multi-Layered Ring of Light. You'll see me using this in a couple boss fights in this video. It's fantastic. It does crazy damage. You can charge it for extra damage, and it just has tremendous range, and it's just a really, really good spell. Probably, arguably, the best all-around holy damage spell if you're just talking about ease of use and damage done. So if you're trying to deal holy damage, that's a good one. You'll also probably see me throw up Elden Stars a few times during this video. I like to use that at the beginning of boss fights when I need to deal holy damage. And a lot of bosses that are weak to holy damage give you an opportunity to use this before they get into melee range. If you're talking about lightning spells, I really like the new spell Knight's Lightning Spear. This thing does phenomenal damage and has phenomenal stance damage as well, so it's good at stance breaks. And it's just a really good one to use at range. It's quite expensive, so it's hard to use on the landscape. You might want to just use Lightning Spear on the landscape if you're running through your FP too much, but you can skew your flasks more to the FP side, so I don't think that's as much of an issue, simply because you just tend to not get hit very much with this build. And Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike is incredible with this build also. You'll see me stance break bosses with it and then finish them off. It's really, really good. We showcase this in our Dragon Priestess build. Highly recommend both of those spells if you're trying to do lightning damage. And what's really good about those two spells as well is they can both be charged too. And if you're talking about fire spells too that I really liked are Flame of the Fell God and Giant's Flame Take Thee. Both of these spells can be charged. Flame of the Fell God you'll use to set up boss fights. You can use this very effectively in the Divine Beast fight and in the Romina fight. You have some time at the beginning usually to cast that. And then flinging Giant's Flame Take Thee does a lot of fire damage. So both ones of those are good. I highly recommend those. Frenzied Burst is also phenomenal if you're looking for a really long-range spell that can target enemies and pick them off, so that's definitely a good fire spell as well. And Rykard's Rancor is also really good, and what I really love is that you can add Rykard's Rancor into your fire repertoire without having to switch the method of casting spells with this, so that can fit in really well, and I highly recommend that fire spell if you're going for fire damage too. For magic damage spells, there are some good options. I really love Ancient Death Rancor. This spell does tons of damage. You can charge it for extra damage. It tracks the enemy, does decent stance damage, and it's just a great overall spell, I find. Night Comet is also not bad. This is another one that can be charged to increase its distance, and it's just kind of a good spell for picking off enemies at longer ranges. And Loretta's Great Bow is also not bad for long range enemies picking them off, and you can charge this up as well. So those are the ones I recommend for elemental damage. There are some physical damage spells as well, but what I generally find is with the buffs that we're getting from our Talismans and from our, well, Flask of Wonders physique, even if physical damage is the best type of damage for a boss, generally speaking, we're still going to be better off going with elemental because of those buffs. So you can try and do physical damage to a boss that's weak or an enemy that's weak to physical damage, depending on what that damage type is. But I just find that it's not overly necessary, but in this case, I'll still go through some decent physical spells. Pest Thread Spears is absolutely phenomenal. This is another new one from the DLC. You can charge this for extra damage. As far as I know, it does piercing damage, I'm pretty sure. It's absolutely fantastic against dragons. It has phenomenal tracking. It'll hit the head of a dragon pretty much no matter what they're doing for really, really high damage. And charging it up increases its damage, so that's really good. And then Stone of Gronk is another good physical damage spell that can be chain cast like in a row very, very quickly. Has decent stance damage, deals standard damage as far as I know. And it's just another good option if you're, trying to deal some physical damage. And then lastly is Rock Sling. This is another spell that deals standard physical damage that has very good stance damage. It's great for attacking dragons, hitting them, knocking them down, and just enemies in general as long as you can stay at range. So again, these are not all the spells you can use in this build, but these are some of the ones that I recommend. And again, if you have to choose between finding the physical weakness of an enemy or the elemental, I highly recommend elemental. So then when it comes to attributes for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 40 Mind, 28 Endurance, 12 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 50 Intelligence, 50 Faith, and 9 Arcane at level 172. Don't need any Arcane for this build. Vigor I wish was probably a little bit higher, but we're already pretty deep into levels. So if you go higher with this build, you might want to take this up to 55 or 60. Mind is at 40 simply because you need a lot of FP to cast these spells regularly. Some of these are super expensive. And even though 38 is the breakpoint for a Flask, sometimes when you're in a boss fight, you don't even need to Flask. So having a larger FP pool during that boss fight will allow you to chuck another spell without having to use a Flask. Taking Mind even higher if you go up with this build wouldn't be a bad idea, so you even have to potentially do that less. Endurance is at 28 simply because you need some stamina in order to fling spells quickly and like roll out of the way. And I find that if I have like around 20 endurance, which is kind of what I started with when I started making this build, sometimes I would run out of stamina and I wouldn't be able to cast even when I had the FP in the opening. So having a little bit more stamina from endurance is not bad, and it will also allow you to wear heavier protection if you want. Strength and Dexterity are simply there at 12 to meet the minimum requirements for Sword of Night and Flame. We pumped Faith and Intelligence for spell casting and for the elemental damage of that weapon, so you really don't need to go higher with Strength and Dexterity. And then finally we have Intelligence and Faith. As I mentioned, you're only going to get 37 sorcery scaling, taking these up to 80 from here, but eventually you will want to do this to just increase your damage more, particularly if you're going into New Game Plus or something like that. You're going to need to squeeze out as much damage as you can. So when it comes to the Flask of Wonders physique here, I have the Blood-Sucking Cracked in here constantly. This increases our damage by 20% no matter what damage type it is, but we will drain health. This is one of the reasons I have the Blessing of the Erdtree spell in here to kind of offset some of that health decay when we're in a boss fight, so that we're not bleeding away in health so quickly, and you'll find that I buff with this constantly before a fight so that I can use this more easily. And then in the other slot there, you're going to change this around to a Shrouding Cracked here, depending on the damage type that you plan to deal. Fire, magic, lightning, sacred, whatever the damage type is, you're going to change it there based on what boss you're facing or what stretch of the game you're facing. And note that you could swap out the Blood-Sucking Cracked tier for the Oil-Soaked tier if you're going for fire damage as well, but this will only increase your damage if the enemy is close to you, and you're not really trying to stay close to the enemy with this build. And obviously we use Golden Vow in order to buff our defenses and damage as well, and that will apply to any damage type, so that is a spell you'll want to use in this build too. So great runes for this build, you're probably either going to use Godric's or Radahn's. We need stats in 7 of the 8 stats for this build, so that would work very, very well. Very few builds need that, so Godric's is a good choice. Radahn's is also not bad for health, FP, and stamina. All those things are valuable to this build. So that wraps up my all-knowing Sage build. I hope I've shown here how much fun this build is to play. Like, you literally just absolutely wreck things when you know what their weaknesses are. You can find these on the wiki if you need help with that. You can look at our damage type video if you need help with that. And also showcasing some really good spells that work here. I hope you've seen those in this video. And the last thing I'll say before wrapping up this video is that this is not a perfectly min-maxed build. If you actually wanted to get max damage per cast, you would be using the Golden Order seal, which scales with Faith and Intelligence, in order to cast your incantations when you're fighting bosses and enemies. and you would be using the Prince of Death's staff once you have a little bit higher stats to cast your sorcery. So you'd get way more damage out of that eventually, particularly as your intelligence and faith get higher. So if you're looking to New Game Plus and beyond, eventually you might want to switch into that, because you'll notice that I'm not really switching my staff around much during a boss fight. So that would prevent you from the need of switching during boss fights. But when you're out on the landscape and you have many different spells selected, it can just be easier to just scroll through your spells, and it's kind of more of a ease of use build than it is perfectly min-maxed. But nonetheless, you can still see how effective it is. As always, if you have further tips or you have questions about the build, leave them in the comments, and I will try and respond to them as soon as I can.